It's time for another episode of Hometown Historic Churches. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Hometown Historic Churches. We're here in Lebanon, Pennsylvania, and we're here at St. Luke's Episcopal Church. We actually did a video here before where I just was doing the pictures for the intro, outro for the different churches here in Lebanon, which is where I've been doing most of these churches, and the bell started to ring, so I decided to do a quick video here. But we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about the church, but I just want to show you the architecture and how beautiful it is, get you a little bit of a close-up, and then we're going to wind up doing one as well on the first ECC church here across the street. It's something else now, but we'll give the history on that as well, and I'll do some stuff with pictures and go a little more into history, because there's quite a bit here to do with Robert Habersham Coleman, and sort of a tragedy. And as we talked about the Colemans before, that they've had a lot of triumph but a lot of tragedy as well. It just sort of seemed to follow them, and this was right after the death of his wife, his first wife that he had married, and she had a lot of health issues, and they traveled over to Europe, and she wound up getting malaria and then died in Paris. And that event has a lot to do with this church, or supposedly has a lot to do with this church, and we're just going to talk about that legend, urban legend, I guess you could say. And so I'm going to turn this camera around and I'm going to show you the church. Just making sure I have this back as far as I can. It really is, it's like a Gothic, this is something that the Colemans were known for. I believe Robert Habersham Coleman, it was his father that actually paid for it, I believe William Coleman, and he put a trust in for all that kind of stuff with the church. But just, this is the old style Gothic revival. We'll talk about the architect as well, with pictures and stuff, because off the top of my head I can't remember. I normally go and refresh myself, but I didn't realize I ran out of data, so I got to do that once I get back home. Wasn't able to look at things, but you just look at the architect. It's just like the Gothic revival style. I believe it has another title as well. You can see the cool window up there. There's different like chapels and things of that nature, but it really is, it's just such a neat structure, so unique. But I believe it was 1880s, I believe, because I think the William Coleman just might have seen it completed and then died shortly thereafter. And Robert Habersham Coleman, he completed the work then, but he actually had his wife was buried here in the crypt when they brought her back from Paris. And I think if I have the story correct, which I'll make sure to correct it later if I don't have it correct, but his second wife, I don't think was terribly thrilled that his first wife was buried here, so they wound up moving her from the crypt here to Philadelphia. It's just such a beautiful, beautiful church. Like, this stonework is just amazing. But yeah, it's really quite a neat structure. But she was buried here for a while. I don't think it was terribly long. But then the Colemans, they have the patriarch of the family, Robert Coleman, is actually buried down in Lancaster. I believe it's called St. James Episcopal Church, and that's where we talked about Ann Coleman, who had committed suicide, who was the fiance of James Buchanan. She had This is just such a neat thing in here. And just the cool like doors, and then like the tile work here as well. Just neat angles. I have some of my photos that I have. You can see some of those. To the glory of God and in memory of his servant, Saint Luke the evangelist, the brother whose praise is in the gospel throughout all the churches. There also is a plaque here somewhere. Yeah, there it is. It says, to the greater glory of, it says, Almighty God, in loving memory of William Henry Warlow, these bells are given by his family. Warlows were a really important family in the community. It's just such neat architecture. It's just one of those things like, this is on Chestnut and 6th Street. It's on the corner there. It's just such a cool place to check out because it's not something that you see every day. It's just such a beautiful, ornate church. I'm sure the inside is beautiful, and to just see the stained glass there from the inside looking out, how it's meant to be viewed, has to be extraordinary. This is actually a really cool area too here at Chestnut Street. There's a lot of really neat houses in this area from Victorian era, and this would have been Victorian era church. But anyways, the story goes when Robert Habersham Coleman's wife passed away, he had, which we know for sure, he had the mansion that he was building for her and himself for their future family. He had that torn down. And they said originally the stones, the romantic version is that the stones went from that mansion and helped to build this church, which are very much the same type of stone, which some of the stone that hadn't been used yet may have very well been sent over here, but the timelines just don't match from when the mansion was torn down to when this was built. And the church records also don't match up with that either. It's not to say that it couldn't be, but the chances of it aren't likely. But the Colemans did have very much to do with this church, and this is on the National Registry of Historic Places. It's just an extraordinary building. So with that, I'm going to say thank you, and the video will continue, and I'll actually give more of the history of this church, the exact dates and all that. But as always, thanks for coming along.
So I wanted to add this information about a little bit more in depth. This church was it was started in 1857. They started out as actually Christ Church of Lebanon, and they would remain that until I believe it was 1865, and then they changed the name to St. Luke's. They actually had William Coleman, was the father of Robert Habersham Coleman. He was among the vestry when the congregation officially organized 1857, 1858. In 1861, William passed away. He left behind the funds dedicated to the church for use in purchasing property and building a church. His widow, Ellen, actually continued to support the parish for decades, including through the funding of the schools, several public reading and recreation rooms, and a children's home that came to be known as Talbot Hall. And they had built that first church, I believe it was in 1863, on the corner where it now stands. Now, the second church was built beginning in 1879, and the cornerstone was laid on October 18th, the feast day of St. Luke, and the consecration followed exactly 1 year later in 1880. Now, Robert Habersham Coleman, he wound out meeting Lily Clark, who he would come to marry her in January of 1879, and she always was ill health, and she fell ill shortly after their marriage, which resulted in they wound up taking what was called a restorative tour in the south of the United States, and it seemed like she wound up doing really, really well, and so he started making plans, Robert Habersham Coleman, to build a mansion for him and Lily and for their future family. And he was talking to his business manager, Artemis Wilhelm, and as they went over to Europe to purchase furnishing and artwork, he continued corresponding with Wilhelm, and they started building this beautiful mansion. And unfortunately, though, Lily wound up getting what's called Roman fever or malaria, and they lengthened their trip hoping to restore Lily's health. But unfortunately, when traveling to Paris, she wound up passing away May 10th, 1880. So Robert Habersham Coleman wound up bringing her back, and they wound up holding construction to inter Lily's remains within the church crypt on May 27th, 1880. They had a private service, and it was ended with the hymn, Nearer My God to Thee. Now, they remained there until, as I had said in the video, his second wife wasn't necessarily comfortable with them being there, so the Colemans also had a burial plot in Laurel Hill Cemetery in Philadelphia, which is where Lily was moved to. And eventually, Edith, his second wife, when she passed away in 1903, she was buried there as well. And eventually, once Robert Habersham Coleman passed away in 1930, he was buried down. Now, the misconceptions that we were talking about, this all having to do with, there were actually several mansions in Cornwall that he had built. One was called Cornwall Hall, which they mistook. It was actually built onto his mother's house, and they thought that the stone from that might have come to St. Luke's, but that is actually not dismantled till the teens in the 1900s, so the timeline doesn't work. And even with his first mansion that he was building for him and Lily, the timeline doesn't really match up there, and none of the records actually show that the stone was taken from there and then brought to St. Luke's. And even like St. Luke's records don't mention anything. They talk about getting a lot of the local bluestone and sandstone from local quarries, and then I guess over the winters they had to go a little bit further. But the Colemans did function as the funders of this church and its building, just like they had. I believe they also played a major role in the Lancaster Episcopal Church as well, the original patriarch Robert Coleman. But just a beautiful church. So let's go a little bit more into some of the more technical information and the people responsible for building this. So some of the more information here. This was, as I said before, it was consecrated. The cornerstone was laid in 1879 by Bishop Howe. The church was built in 1880. It was designed by a New York architect, Henry Martin Congdon, in the Ruskinian Gothic style. And then it was paid for by William Coleman and Robert Habersham Coleman. And it was dedicated in the memory of Lily Coleman. Her last name had been Clark before they had gotten married. So this building is actually in the form of a Latin cross, and is constructed of the native bluestone and sandstone that I had mentioned earlier. It's 116 feet long and 75 feet wide, and it features a square 85-foot tall tower with it's an octagonal turret, and the roof is covered in rows of blue and red slate. It was added to the National Registry of Historic Places in 1974, and as I said before, it was incorporated in 1859 as the Christ Church of Lebanon, and eventually changed the name to St. Luke's in 1865. But it had been started as early as 1857. But this is an extraordinary building. It's another example of the Colemans and just the aesthetic looks that they had in the buildings that they made. And just a lot of these things that at least there's something that's representative of what the Colemans did for the community, and just the style that they had, because it's just a beautiful church, and it's just very unique in the area. And this is on the corner of 6th and Chestnut Street in Lebanon, Pennsylvania. And as always, I want to say thank you for coming along and visiting another hometown historic church, and we will see you about town.